You want leaders that understand the dynamic of the community. They're able to go into the organization that they serve, in the community that they serve, and make traction, right? To be able to move in a direction that's going to have serious outcome and impact for their young people without making excuses for why they're not able to accomplish that work.
All right, welcome to my leadership series, and I have an exciting conversation. We spent a long time talking. Nateasha McVea is the assistant superintendent at Roosevelt Union School District in New York, and we spent over 2 hours talking. I'm not going to share all 2 hours of this conversation, but I'm going to share all the little nuggets that we got from this. So check it out. All right, welcome Nateasha. I'm so excited to have you for this conversation because as the assistant superintendent at Roosevelt Free Union School District, I think you're thinking so much about what the kind of the future of leadership might look like in your organization. And as you think about the work that you've done, being a veteran in New York State and as an educator and as a leader, you and I talked a little bit about how fast you moved through the ranks. I think leadership was so different pre-COVID. And then, while we're currently in the heart of the pandemic, like leadership looks very different. But then, I think as we look and plan for the future with all of the things around the pandemic and equity issues and just so much going on, just personally and professionally, what should leaders look like, or what kind of development do leaders need going forward, you think?
That's a very interesting question because one would think that the role of leadership has shifted post-COVID because it requires that you actually think and operate in a slightly different fashion. But when you think of the role of a leader, that ability to strategically make those decisions, it's an additional element in the work that we do. So when I think about leadership, pre-COVID, post-COVID, I'm thinking in terms of someone who understands the need, right? So whether it's the internal need of the district and the individuals who are responsible for impacting student outcomes, coupled with the external need, that social capital piece, so what's happening in society. They themselves as a leader, I feel should be very much so self-aware. And then I also too believe that self-awareness must come with some of that social awareness for the community that they serve. The beginnings of that creates a nice start for someone who strategically wants to work towards a design goal or purpose, that they're driven toward accomplishing a very specific task with very specific outcomes connected to students, right? So now it becomes, well, how do I design the systems and structures that are going to get me there? You're looking for a leader that is strategic in how they lead. They're not coming in with a one-size-fits-all model. You're no longer looking at leadership where you have someone who believes they're going to assume the role and they're going to manage the role based on what's historically there. We're in a very interesting space as educators within the states, I'll say, not just New York State, but the United States. We're still very much so deeply rooted in operating an old model for how we educate our young people comparatively to other nations. While we believe we're progressive in how we lead and how we educate our young people, we really haven't reformed much. We're trying to operate with a lot of new, right? And now COVID presents new in terms of just how you interact. Something as simple as what education looks like on a more social scale between educators and their students in the community, that has shifted, right? So we're doing more of this. How do you now translate the information, that feeling of a relationship, trust, and all of those qualities that you want to have resonate as a leader in this format? That takes some skill. There's some strategy that needs to be put in place so that you're able to do what's necessary. How do you now account for the realities of the society that you may serve socially? We have quite a few of our families economically may be stressed. You have some that health-wise are stressed. And you're coupled with meeting the needs of your overall community, that's very different than the traditional term of meeting the needs. We used to think about diversity and socioeconomic status as subgroups and just educational jargon. Now we're looking at ourselves in a more global way and what that impact is like for the experience that we have that's touching everyone. So now, as a leader, what I knew may have been impactful as a microcosm of what the communities I serve are faced with, a lot of challenge. That challenge is so widespread that it's no longer just the story of districts that are marginalized and underserved. Now it's a greater conversation, and that greater, stronger conversation is beginning to involve a variety of leaders and discussions that they may not have had prior to this. So working in a district that is traditionally marginalized, I don't like to use the term underserved, but underserved on a more statewide, federal level in comparison to local districts that are right next door, we really didn't interact in a way in which we spoke the same language. Their needs in their district may have been their needs. My needs in a high needs district were my needs. Now we're beginning to cross those lines because the needs are very similar, that the racial, ethnic, social, economic, health deficit that you may have seen presented in certain districts throughout the nation is now becoming the story in many districts. So when we start talking about how do we move the needle with our students to close the gaps that seem to be getting wider, what does that look like when you have accountability measures that have not shifted given COVID? You're still expected to educate young people, quality at high levels, but you still have to account for a different way of doing. If you don't have someone who's flexible and fluid in their leadership that understands the work, that's going to present a very strong challenge for districts that were already working with a deficit. But you also don't want leaders that have that deficit thinking or a deficit model of how they approach the communities that they serve. You want leaders that understand the dynamic of the community, but they already have a purpose for the work that they do. And they know that given what the expectation is that they have at high levels, they're able to go into the organization that they serve, in the community that they serve, and make traction, right? To be able to move in a direction that's going to have serious outcome and impact for their young people without making excuses for why they're not able to accomplish that work. So COVID has presented an interesting way of looking at what we do, because it really is more equitable, the role of the leader right now than it was before. The conversations are similar and the expectations are similar, but you still have the gaps getting wider. So I'm not delusional in thinking that because my neighbors are experiencing the same thing that we're experiencing on a global scale, that we now speak completely and totally the same language around need and approach. I understand that the community that I serve, the gap just widened. And what does that look like when you already started with a deficit and now you have to account for how you bring us back to where you would like to go realistically, but focusing on meeting the needs of your students by meeting the needs of the adults. I think sometimes we get lost in, as leaders, trying to please our adult population and not really understanding that you have a different set of learners. So as the leader of learners, you yourself have to constantly learn and be innovative about how you approach the work so that you can help model and inform and support the teachers and leaders that are responsible for carrying out that work. You'll be able to, with more structure, now see the impact and the needle moving with student outcomes if you know that everyone's working towards the same purpose and they're doing that with very little variance in how they do it, that the expectations are clear and everyone's working towards the same goal. I don't know that there's a lot of leaders out there that come with that thinking that you have to be strategic about how you approach the work and then come up with a nice solid plan for where you want to go. So you already have an idea of where you want to be, what that vision is for the work that you have, but then you have a realistic approach of how to get there. That realistic approach does not mean that at any point you dumb down the expectations or lessen the expectations. You just have to approach the work in a different way. And sometimes it does mean that you lend a little more time, that you do become more informed, that you stay abreast of what the newest and latest may be as far as your practice as a leader. But how many leaders are doing that? We have a lot of veteran leaders who are finding themselves used to leading in the way that they've always led, without question. We have new accountability measures, and many of those leaders are finding themselves retiring. But now you have new leaders that are coming out of programs for universities I'll speak to within the states that are educating them in a manner in which they believe they're educating students for 21st century skills. But the programs look very much so like the program that I may have been in 10 years ago. How is that even possible? How are you still going through the same readings and the syllabus looks very much the same when what we're faced with today isn't a stagnant process? So it makes for an interesting conversation when you talk about the preparation of leadership from the foundation. What does that look like for how our higher educational institutions are preparing leaders for today's leadership with yesterday's methods? So that innovation piece and leaning more towards the personal drive of the leader, you start to look for some of that. So when I look for principals as an assistant superintendent, I'm looking for someone who works outside of the mold, that doesn't sound like every other leader that's coming in with the educational jargon. They have to be knowledgeable and you want them to know the work, but you also want them to be realistic and understand that what they may have received in their 4-year program or 2-year program, depending on the degree, is very different than what they're expected to do. And how do you now couple the two together to really make strides? That's a lot.
Yeah, I think you must have read my mind because I know I didn't share any questions with you, but there were probably 3 or 4 questions that I was thinking about as you were responding, and you already had the answers to those questions. But I did have one question. This comes up a lot with districts and educators in particular, where they're like, well, that's big picture. I got to work on these details, blah blah blah. And so, how do we teach strategic thinking in school systems? Because systems thinking and strategic thinking is something that I do feel isn't commonplace in the way we develop leaders in schools today.
My overall goal, first and foremost, is to be very clear about where our students are and where we want them to go, right? So just for myself as an assistant superintendent, my title says I'm responsible for curriculum and instruction. Depending on how the person in my role defines what that looks like, you can get a very different approach to the assistant superintendency. My thinking about this role is that my responsibility around scope, sequence, pacing doesn't stop just there with monitoring standard base and making sure that teachers have the materials that they need and they go through the continuum of learning. The instructional part for me is huge because that instructional part involves leadership and the teacher as practitioner. The leaders have to be clear about what high quality instruction looks like because they're responsible at their sites for the monitoring, support, and accountability of those teachers around this instruction. So what does that look like when we say we're evaluating or observing teachers at high levels of effectiveness for instruction if you don't know what explicit instruction actually looks like? If you're not clear about the practices and protocols that should be in place as the leader, my responsibility goes beyond just curriculum and instructional talk and a roadmap for that. I have to now take a very close look at the leaders to see, do you know and are you clear about what that looks like at high levels and how that's directly impactful or correlated to student outcomes? And what you do, while it may be indirect, it is direct because you're responsible for the adults in the building and that work. And now how do I create a credible message and opportunity for you to lend feedback around this work as the leader that wants to evoke some change if you're not speaking the right language or looking for the right things? Then that brings me to the work of our teachers as leaders. How do I now get them to a place where they're clear about their responsibility around the work, what it should look like, and the supports I want to put in place to help strengthen and grow the teacher so that now we equip our students with what it is they need. It's almost as if I view the position that I'm in as not only just the educator of the larger scope of work to monitor what's happening so that we educate our young people, but I'm responsible for the education, the pedagogy and practice of leadership. I have to make sure that the two are seamless so that we know what we're working towards. Leaders have to know what they're looking for at high levels so that they're able to now monitor and support that work of teachers and give feedback. If you can't give actionable feedback that's going to impact and help support the work of your teachers, then what are you actually saying to them when you evaluate their work? Because now if you're looking at student data and you know you want to move the needle in a specific direction because you want those outcomes to be high, how do you get there? That all goes back into like the practitioner. What are teachers doing and saying in front of children that as the leader, you're equipped to monitor and support to get to a place where you now can observe your students? If I go into a classroom as a leader, before I look at what teachers are doing and saying, I go right to the students. If students are interacting and thinking and grappling with the work, I know that the teacher has taught them how to do that. Then that brings me to a place where I now want to turn my attention back to the educator to see, okay, where are they and what are they doing? And it goes back to our children. In most situations, the leaders have been taught to observe the teacher. Very few leaders go in to look at really teaching and learning. They're looking at teaching and they just want to get through it, whatever it is, to be able to evaluate them according to the rubric the district may have agreed on with the union. They're not even clear on how to use that rubric. They're not clear about the research base that developed that rubric and what that means for how we're approaching the work that we do. So as an assistant superintendent of curriculum and instruction, I feel my responsibility is always going to be on the professional development side of both my leaders and teachers so that they can tackle the work before we start to get into that approach we talked about related to like coherence and purpose-driven work and all of what the research says. If they're not clear about the 101s, leadership 101, teaching 101, we're going to have a very difficult time.
All right, I hope you got the big takeaway from Nateasha that self-awareness is critical to being a great leader. Not only self-awareness, but the fact that you understand how to execute on your purpose. Understanding how you execute on your purpose through self-awareness will allow you to lead better. Peace.